So in this presentation, we're going to take a look at two things, photosynthesis and respiration, and we're going to look at how they're related to one another. So first we need to think about what photosynthesis is, and it's basically one of the most important chemical reactions on the planet. Some people may argue that it's not for all life the most important, but certainly for organisms that live on the surface of the earth, it is. Now when you start thinking about organisms that live like way down deep in the ocean near hydrothermal vents, they don't rely on sunlight for their energy, they rely on the chemicals in the water for their energy. But we're not going to talk to them, so we're going to call this the most important. So when we think about what happens, what is the process of photosynthesis, we need to think about what happens and where it happens. So what happens is light energy is converted into chemical energy. Okay, so light energy is changed to another type of energy and stored. Okay, and we'll talk about that in the third quarter when we talk about energy. We'll talk about conversion of energy. But for now, we need to think about it in this particular instance. So that energy, again, is stored as sugar, as a carbohydrate. And this occurs in plants and also in some algae. Now the plant needs light energy, carbon dioxide, and water in order to have this chemical reaction take place. And the place where it happens in the plant is a little organelle, part of a cell, called a chloroplast. Okay, so there's chlorophyll, and that's what makes the plant green. That chlorophyll is actually able to use the energy from the sun to convert water and carbon dioxide into sugar. So what happens in this chemical reaction? Well, it's pretty simple. The plant uses energy from the sun, again, to combine water and carbon dioxide. So here's a little diagram that might help you out. You've got energy from the sun, combining carbon dioxide and water are joined together using that energy from the sun. And that produces glucose and also oxygen. So sugar and oxygen are the byproducts. So at the bottom here, we've got a description of this chemical reaction in words. So again, we need to make sure we remember that it's in the chloroplast of the plant, or the plant cell, I should say, that this chemical reaction takes place. And usually, after the chemical reaction has occurred, the glucose or the starch is actually stored in the plant, and that chemical energy is stored in the bonds of the sugar molecule. So how would a scientist write this? Because a scientist isn't just going to write down all those words. Scientists use chemical symbols to represent what they're trying to talk about. So a scientist would write this a little differently than what we just did. It would look something like this. And you're probably saying, I don't get that. What is that supposed to mean? So what this means is that there are 6 carbon dioxide molecules combining with 6 water molecules. And when that happens, it forms one glucose molecule, which is that big long one there, the C6H12O6. And it also, another product would be the 6 oxygen molecules. So let's take a look at this one more time a little more graphically. Okay, so there's where it all starts. Okay, the chlorophyll that traps energy from the sun. So we have the sun, which gives energy to the chlorophyll, and the plant uses that energy to convert carbon dioxide, which enters through the little holes in the leaves that we talked about in that activity in class called the stomata, and the water, which is absorbed by the roots, enters the plant as well. And using the energy from the sun, that's converted to oxygen, which is released into the air, and glucose, or sugar, which is converted to starch, which is stored in other parts of the plant, like the stem and the fruit and things like that. So why is this important? Well, it all boils down to the fact that animals are not able to make their own food. Okay, so we cannot get our energy directly from the sun, but the plants can. So that's where the beginning of the food chain is. The plants are the first step in the food chain. And also the plants produce oxygen for animals and other living organisms to use. So that's a very, very important process that goes on in the world. Now, respiration, there are two types actually. So the two types of respiration are breathing and something called cellular respiration. So cellular respiration, just like photosynthesis, is a chemical reaction. And you can think of it as probably the most important chemical reaction in our bodies, because that's where we get our energy from. So again, it's a process like photosynthesis. And here, instead of taking place in a chloroplast, because not too many animals, actually no animal that I know of, has a chloroplast. That's strictly in plant cells. But animal cells have something called mitochondria, and that's where respiration takes place. So what happens is the mitochondria takes in nutrients, the glucose, and also oxygen, and instead of creating something, it actually breaks down the glucose and releases energy, and that energy is used by the cell. So this is what's known as cellular respiration. And it takes place in all living things, including plants. So like I said earlier, this is basically the reverse of photosynthesis. Okay? An animal takes in glucose and oxygen, and it breaks it down into carbon dioxide and water. And when it does that, there's a release of energy. So that's where we get our energy from. So this process of a cell creating its own energy is known as cellular respiration. And I guess you really can't say it creates its own energy. It just breaks down the compounds, the sugar compound, by using oxygen and forms energy and carbon dioxide and water. So here's a graphic look at respiration. So oxygen is taken in from the air, and then an organism takes in carbohydrates from plants or by eating other animals or something like that. And the mitochondria takes in those things, and it breaks down the carbohydrate. And when it does that, it releases carbon dioxide into the air and also water vapor. So when we breathe, you can feel, if you breathe up against some glass, you'll actually see, like you'll fog up the mirror or whatever, and that's because there's water in our breath. Okay, so those two things are released into the air, and energy is released into the cell, and it's used by the organism. So here's the chemical equation for respiration. We've got sugar molecule, so that's C6H12O6, that's glucose, and you add some oxygen to it, and what's created is carbon dioxide and water. So there's the chemical equation written down as a chemical formula. So if we look at number 10 in your graphic organizer, I want you to look at these pictures and tell me if there are any similarities that you notice. So in the graphic organizer, you need to list at least 3. So now we can look at the chemical equation for photosynthesis and respiration and compare them. And it's pretty obvious what's happening. In photosynthesis, energy is taken in by the plant, and it converts carbon dioxide and water into sugar and oxygen. In respiration, that sugar and oxygen is broken down into carbon dioxide and water, and energy is released. So we've got the same things involved in both of these chemical reactions. They're just happening in a different order. So I guess you could say that without photosynthesis, we couldn't have respiration.